For decades, Russia watched American artillery development with smug satisfaction. While Moscow fielded thousands of howitzers and multiple rocket launchers capable of flattening entire grid squares, the United States invested in precision-guided munitions and high-tech systems that seemed more expensive than effective. Russian generals scoffed at American obsession with accuracy over volume, arguing that modern warfare was still about massing fires and overwhelming the enemy with steel rain. Their doctrine, refined through conflicts in Chechnya, Georgia, and Syria, relied on one simple principle: he who fires the most shells wins. The numbers seemed to prove them right. Russia maintained over 6,000 artillery pieces and rocket systems, compared to just a few hundred comparable American platforms. In February 2022, when Russian forces invaded Ukraine, they brought that doctrine with them. Massive artillery barrages preceded every advance, turning Ukrainian positions into moonscapes. For the first months of the war, Russian guns fired an estimated 20,000 rounds per day, a rate of fire that dwarfed anything Ukraine could answer with. Western analysts warned that Ukraine was being outgunned 10-1, that Russian artillery superiority would grind down any defense through sheer attrition. Moscow's state media declared victory inevitable, mocking Western weapons shipments as too little, too sophisticated, and too late to matter against raw firepower. Then something arrived on the battlefield that changed everything. Not more howitzers, not matching Russia, shell for shell, but a system so precise and so lethal it turned Russian doctrine into a death sentence for anyone operating traditional artillery. The high-mobility artillery rocket system, better known as HIMARS, did not try to match Russian volume. It made volume irrelevant. How did a handful of truck-mounted rocket launchers paralyze an artillery force that outnumbered them 50-1? And why did the weapon Russia dismissed as overpriced American technology become the system that turned their greatest strength into their most fatal vulnerability? In the opening weeks of the Ukraine invasion, Russian artillery operated with near impunity. Batteries of two S-19 IMST self-propelled howitzers positioned themselves 15 to 20 kilometers behind the front lines, safely out of range of Ukrainian counter-battery fire. From these positions, they could rain shells on Ukrainian defenses without fear of retaliation. The Russian doctrine was simple but effective. Find a target, mass fires from multiple batteries, obliterate the grid square, then move before anyone could respond. The two S-19 IMST could fire 6 rounds per minute, delivering 152 mm high explosive shells that created kill zones 50 meters in diameter. A battery of 6 guns firing for just 5 minutes could saturate an area the size of 3 football fields with over 180 shells. Ukrainian positions, trenches, and bunkers were pounded into rubble. Survivors described the bombardments as apocalyptic, unending cascades of explosions that made coherent defense impossible. Russian multiple-launch rocket systems added another layer of devastation. The BM-27 Uragan and BM-30 Smerch could fire salvos of 16 to 12 rockets respectively, covering entire square kilometers with submunitions or high explosives. A single Smerch salvo could deliver 72 fragmentation warheads, each one creating a lethal radius of 30 meters. Against troops in the open or lightly fortified positions, the effect was catastrophic. Ukrainian commanders reported losing entire companies to single bombardments. Soldiers buried alive or shredded by shrapnel before they could even identify the threat. The Russian approach was quintessentially Soviet: mass, simplicity, and overwhelming firepower. Artillery officers did not need sophisticated targeting. They received grid coordinates from forward observers or drones, calculated firing solutions using decades-old methods, and unleashed barrages that saturated the target area. Precision was less important than volume. If the enemy was somewhere in a 500-meter square, you destroyed the entire square. The approach was brutal, wasteful, and undeniably effective when ammunition was plentiful. By late spring 2022, Russian forces were firing between 40,000 and 60,000 artillery rounds per day across the entire front. Ukraine, by comparison, managed perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 rounds daily, constrained by ammunition shortages and limited artillery systems. The imbalance was staggering. Ukrainian gunners fired 1 shell for every 10 Russian shells, and the attrition showed. Defensive lines crumbled under sustained bombardment. Ukrainian forces withdrew from positions that had become untenable, trading space for survival. Russian commanders grew confident. They had seen this pattern before, in Grozny, in Aleppo, in countless smaller conflicts where artillery superiority translated directly into battlefield victory. The formula was proven. pound the enemy into submission, then advance through the rubble. Western weapons, precision-guided or not, could not change the fundamental arithmetic of firepower. Or so they thought. The Russian artillery doctrine had one critical vulnerability, a weakness so fundamental that it undermined every advantage they possessed. The guns and rocket launchers that delivered such devastating fires were also the most valuable targets on the battlefield. Destroying a single artillery battery did not just eliminate 6 guns, it removed the crew, the ammunition stockpiles, the command vehicles, and the logistics chain supporting them. One successful strike could silence an entire sector's fires for days, but counter-battery fire required 2 things, detection and range. Ukrainian forces had detection. American supplied AN/TPQ-36 and AN/TPQ-49 counter-battery radars could track incoming shells and calculate the firing position within seconds. The problem was range. Ukrainian artillery, mostly Soviet-era 2S-1 Gvozdika and 2S-3 Akatsiya howitzers, maxed out at 15 to 20 kilometers. Russian batteries positioned at 18 kilometers were safe. They could fire, knowing Ukrainian guns could not reach them. The math was simple and cruel. Russia could strike Ukraine, but Ukraine could not strike back. This asymmetry defined the first 4 months of the war. Ukrainian gunners watched their radar screens light up with Russian firing positions, calculated the distance, and realized they were beyond effective range. The frustration was maddening. They knew exactly where the enemy was, but they could not touch them. Russian artillery operated in what military planners call a sanctuary, a zone beyond the reach of enemy fires where they could operate with impunity. Russian logisticians exploited this advantage ruthlessly. Ammunition depots were positioned 30 to 40 kilometers behind the front, far beyond the range of any Ukrainian strike capability. Command posts operated from the same safe distances. Fuel and supply convoys moved along roads they knew Ukraine could not interdict. The entire logistics tail of the Russian military sat in a bubble of safety, untouchable and therefore complacent. Western military observers watched this imbalance with growing concern. Ukraine was losing the artillery duel not because of inferior tactics or poor training, but because of simple physics. Range dictated who could shoot and who could not. No amount of bravery or skill could overcome that fundamental disadvantage. Some analysts argued that the war would be decided by artillery, and Russia's numerical and range superiority made victory inevitable. Ukrainian requests for long-range strike systems grew desperate. President Zelensky appealed directly to Western leaders, explaining that without the ability to strike Russian artillery and logistics, the war would be lost through attrition. The United States and its allies hesitated, concerned about escalation, worried that providing systems capable of striking deep into Russian-held territory might provoke a wider conflict. The debate dragged on for months while Russian shells continued to fall. Then, in late June 2022, the calculus changed. The United States authorized the transfer of M142 high-mobility artillery rocket systems to Ukraine. The first 4 systems arrived in theater on June 23rd, and with them came a weapon that would redefine the battlefield. Not by matching Russian firepower, but by rendering it irrelevant through precision and range that Russian forces could not counter. The M142 HIMARS is deceptively simple in appearance, a 6-wheeled truck carrying a single launch pod with 6 rockets. It looks unremarkable, almost utilitarian, lacking the visual impact of a massive howitzer or a tracked self-propelled gun. But the simplicity is deceptive. Inside that single pod sits enough precision firepower to destroy targets Russian artillery commanders thought were completely safe. The system fires the M31 Guided Multiple Launch Rocket System munition, better known as GMLRS. Each rocket is 13 feet long, weighs 675 pounds, and carries a 200-pound high-explosive warhead. But the revolutionary part is not the explosive, it is the guidance system. Each GMLRS rocket has an inertial navigation system coupled with GPS guidance, allowing it to adjust its flight path and strike within 10 meters of the target coordinates. For artillery, that is sniper-level precision. The range is what changes everything. Standard GMLRS rockets can reach targets 70 kilometers away, over 43 miles. The extended range variant pushes that to 90 kilometers or 56 miles. That range means a HIMARS system positioned 30 kilometers behind Ukrainian lines can strike Russian artillery batteries 40 kilometers behind Russian lines. The sanctuary that protected Russian guns evaporates. Suddenly, nowhere within 70 kilometers of the front is safe. the system's mobility is equally critical. HIMARS is mounted on a family of medium tactical vehicles truck, the same chassis used for regular supply vehicles throughout the U.S. military. The truck can drive on highways at 85 kilometers per hour, maneuver on rough terrain, and set up for firing in under 5 minutes. The crew receives targeting coordinates, drives to a pre-surveyed firing position, raises the launch pod, fires the 6 rockets in rapid succession, and drives away. The entire process, from arrival to departure, takes less than 10 minutes. By the time Russian counter-battery radar detects the launch and calculates a response, the HIMARS is already 5 kilometers away. The Ukrainian military grasped the implications immediately. They did not need dozens of HIMARS to counter thousands of Russian guns. They needed just enough to create a credible threat against every Russian artillery position within range. And because HIMARS was accurate enough to hit specific targets rather than saturate areas, one HIMARS firing 6 rockets could achieve what would have required hundreds of conventional artillery rounds. The first confirmed HIMARS strike came on June 26, 2022, 3 days after the systems arrived. The target was a Russian ammunition depot near Izium, a logistics hub supporting Russian forces in the Donbass. The depot sat 50 kilometers behind Russian lines, well beyond the reach of any Ukrainian system Russia knew about. Security was minimal. Trucks came and went openly, unloading shells and rockets that were stored in the open or in lightly protected buildings. At 2:30 a.m., 6 GMLRS rockets struck the depot in rapid succession. Each rocket hit a different section of the facility, the GPS guidance ensuring that the explosions were spaced to maximize coverage. Secondary explosions began immediately, cooking off stored ammunition and creating a chain reaction that lasted over 6 hours. Satellite imagery the next day showed the depot completely destroyed, buildings collapsed, and craters where ammunition piles had stood. Estimates suggested over 10,000 artillery rounds were lost in the strike, along with fuel, spare parts, and other supplies. Russian forces did not immediately understand what had happened. Initial reports suggested a massive Ukrainian artillery barrage, but the precision of the strikes did not match that theory. Ukrainian artillery was not accurate enough to hit 6 specific points in a 500-meter facility from 50 kilometers away. As intelligence officers reviewed the damage, a more disturbing possibility emerged. The Americans had given Ukraine a system capable of striking deep into what Russia considered secure rear areas. The second strike came 2 days later, targeting a command post near Donetsk. The building, a requisitioned school, housed the headquarters of a Russian artillery brigade. Officers inside coordinated fires across a 30-kilometer front, directing dozens of batteries in support of ground operations. The HIMARS strike hit at 3 a.m. when most of the staff was present. All 6 rockets struck within seconds, collapsing the building and killing an estimated 40 officers and soldiers. The brigade lost its entire command structure in a single engagement. Russian artillery operations in that sector ground to a halt. Without coordination, individual batteries fired sporadically, unable to mass fires or respond to requests from ground units. Ukrainian forces, sensing the disruption, launched local counterattacks that reclaimed several kilometers of territory before Russian command could reorganize. The message was clear. HIMARS did not just destroy material. It decapitated command structures and created opportunities that Ukrainian forces could exploit. By mid-July, HIMARS had struck over 30 high-value targets: ammunition depots, fuel storage, command posts, and artillery positions. Russian forces began to realize the threat was not going away. The strikes were not random or lucky. They were surgical, hitting the exact targets that would cause maximum disruption. Ukrainian intelligence, likely augmented by Western satellite and signals intelligence, was identifying critical nodes in the Russian logistics chain, and HIMARS was eliminating them one by one. Russian commanders responded by pushing their logistics further back, relocating ammunition depots to 80 or 90 kilometers behind the lines. But this created new problems. The further back supplies were stored, the longer it took to bring them forward. Trucks spent more time on the road, consuming fuel and creating bottlenecks. Artillery units that once had ammunition delivered directly to their positions now had to send trucks on multi-hour round trips to fetch shells. The rate of fire, already declining due to barrel wear and crew fatigue, dropped further. Artillery batteries themselves began dispersing, spreading out to reduce the damage from a single strike. But dispersion reduced their effectiveness. Massed fires required multiple batteries shooting at the same target simultaneously. When those batteries were 5 kilometers apart instead of 1, coordination became harder and the weight of fire decreased. The Russian doctrine, built around concentration, was being forced to adapt to a reality where concentration meant vulnerability. The psychological impact was profound. Russian artillerymen, accustomed to firing without fear of retaliation, now faced the possibility that any shot could reveal their position and bring a precision strike within minutes. Some batteries stopped firing altogether, paralyzed by the threat. Others limited their fires to single salvos before immediately displacing, reducing their effectiveness but increasing their survival chances. The aggressive, sustained bombardments that had characterized the early months of the war became sporadic and cautious. Ukrainian forces sensed the shift. Where they had once endured 24-hour bombardments, they now experienced intermittent fire that gave them time to recover, reposition, and counterattack. Russian offensives, dependent on artillery preparation to soften defenses before infantry assaults, began to falter. Attacks went forward without adequate fire support, and Russian casualties spiked as they encountered defenses that were still intact. By August 2022, Russia's daily artillery fire had dropped from 60,000 rounds to less than 20,000. Some of this was due to ammunition shortages, barrels worn beyond serviceability, and logistics disruptions. But a significant portion was fear. Fear that firing would bring a HIMARS strike, fear that the ammunition depot they relied on would be destroyed overnight, fear that the command post coordinating their operations would be hit before dawn. Russian artillery, once the dominant force on the battlefield, was now operating under constraints that made sustained operations impossible. The HIMARS effect extended beyond direct strikes. Ukrainian forces began shaping operations around the knowledge that Russian logistics were vulnerable. They planned offensives to coincide with HIMARS strikes on ammunition depots, knowing Russian forces would run out of shells mid-battle. They targeted Russian command posts just before major attacks, decapitating the enemy's ability to respond. The rocket system became not just a strike platform, but a tool for creating strategic opportunities. The Kharkiv counteroffensive in September 2022 showcased this integration. In the days leading up to the attack, HIMARS struck ammunition depots, fuel storage, and command nodes throughout the Russian rear area. When Ukrainian forces launched their assault, Russian artillery could not respond effectively. Batteries had no shells, command posts could not coordinate fires, and logistics convoys were afraid to move. The counteroffensive advanced 50 kilometers in 3 days, liberating territory faster than Russian forces could retreat. The offensive was a combined armed success, but HIMARS created the conditions that made it possible. Russian military bloggers, often more honest than state media, began documenting the disaster. Posts on Telegram channels described ammunition shortages so severe that some batteries were rationed to 10 rounds per day. Soldiers complained that their logistics officers were terrified to position supply dumps anywhere near the front. One widely shared post from a Russian artilleryman described watching a HIMARS strike destroy his battalion's ammunition stockpile, leaving them without shells for a week. He wrote, "We used to laugh at American artillery, saying they waste money on fancy weapons. Now we are the ones dying because we cannot shoot back." Russian attempts to counter HIMARS were frantic but ineffective. They deployed additional air defense systems to protect logistics hubs, but GMLRS rockets flew ballistic trajectories that were difficult to intercept. The flight time from launch to impact was under 3 minutes at maximum range, giving air defense operators almost no time to react. Some rockets were intercepted, but the success rate was low enough that it did not meaningfully reduce the threat. Russian forces also attempted to hunt HIMARS systems using drones, electronic warfare, and airstrikes. But the mobility of the platform made targeting nearly impossible. By the time Russian intelligence identified a HIMARS launch position and passed coordinates to strike assets, the launcher was long gone. Ukrainian operators became experts at shoot-and-scoot tactics, never firing from the same position twice, and moving constantly to avoid pattern recognition. The economic calculus was devastating for Russia. Each GMLRS rocket cost approximately $150,000. A 6-rocket salvo was $900,000. That sounds expensive until you consider what it destroyed: ammunition depots holding tens of millions of dollars in shells, command posts housing hundreds of trained officers, and artillery batteries representing years of production. A single HIMARS strike could eliminate assets worth 50 times the cost of the munitions used. The exchange ratio favored Ukraine overwhelmingly. By late 2022, Russia's artillery advantage had evaporated. They still possessed more guns, but those guns were firing fewer rounds, positioned further from the front and operating under constant threat. The doctrine that relied on massed fires and overwhelming volume had been rendered obsolete by precision strikes that eliminated the logistics sustaining those fires. Russian generals who had mocked American precision over volume now faced the reality that precision had neutralized volume entirely. Ukrainian requests for additional HIMARS were approved in stages. By early 2023, Ukraine had received 38 systems, enough to maintain coverage across the entire front. The systems operated in rotation with some firing while others moved or resupplied. The continuous presence of HIMARS meant Russian forces could never relax, could never assume their rear. Areas were safe and could never mass logistics in quantities sufficient to support large-scale operations. The strategic impact extended beyond Ukraine. NATO militaries, watching HIMARS systematically dismantle Russian artillery doctrine, began re-evaluating their own force structures. The lesson was clear. Precision strike systems with sufficient range could neutralize mass fires, making quantity less important than accuracy and survivability. Countries that had invested in large artillery parks began shifting resources toward rocket systems and loitering munitions that offered similar effects with greater flexibility. Russian military theorists were forced into painful self-examination. Articles in professional military journals admitted that the doctrine built over decades was vulnerable to capabilities they had not anticipated. One 2023 article in the Journal of Military Thought acknowledged that high-precision, long-range strike systems fundamentally alter the calculus of artillery warfare, making traditional mass fires obsolete in environments where the adversary possesses credible counter-battery capabilities. The admission was remarkable, a public acknowledgement that the foundation of Russian ground combat power had been invalidated. Right now, HIMARS continues to operate across Ukraine, striking targets that support Russian military operations. The system that Russia dismissed as expensive American over-engineering has become the weapon that broke their artillery dominance. The doctrine that relied on outgunning the enemy 10-1 collapsed when the enemy could strike back from 50 miles away with precision that made every round count. The mockery has ended. The shells have stopped falling, and the artillery force that was supposed to grind Ukraine into submission is now the one hiding, dispersing, and fearing the sound of 6 rockets arcing through the sky. The balance of power, built on volume and mass, was shattered by precision and range. When one side can strike the other's logistics without fear of retaliation, numbers become irrelevant. And the truck-mounted rocket system that looked so unimpressive proved that in modern warfare, it is not how much you can shoot that matters. It is what you can hit and from how far away. What do you think? Has HIMARS permanently changed artillery warfare, or will Russia find a way to adapt? Drop your thoughts below.